Chapter 2.1 Religion as the Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it, from every wholesome restriction, all social political movements tending in the direction invariably try to cut the ground from under the religions. 4. In order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything beside the state must be taken from him. But religion means dependence on and submission to irrational facts of his experience. These do not refer directly to social and physical conditions. They concern far more with the individual's psychic attitude. But it is possible to have an attitude to the external conditions of life only when there is a point of reference outside them. The religions give or claim to give such a standpoint, thereby enabling the individual to exercise his judgment and his power of decision. They build up a reserve, as it were, against the obvious and inevitable force of circumstances to which everyone is exposed who lives only in the outer world and has no other ground under his feet except the pavement. If statistical reality is the only reality, then it is the sole authority. There is only one condition, and since no contrary condition exists, judgments and decisions are not only superfluous but impossible. Then the individual is bound to function of statistics, and hence a function of the state, or whereby the abstract principle of order may be called. The religions, however, teach another authority opposed to that of the world. The doctrine of individuals' dependence on God makes just as high a claim upon him as the world does. It may even happen that the absoluteness of these claims estranges him from the world in the same way as he is estranged from himself when he succumbs to the collective mentality. He can forfeit his judgment and power of decision in the former case, in brackets, for the sake of religious doctrine, quite as much in the latter. This is the goal the religions openly aspire to, unless they compromise with the state. When they do, I prefer to call them not religions, but creeds. A creed gives expression to a definitive collective belief, whereas the world religion expresses a subjective relationship to certain metaphysical, extra-mundane factors. A creed is a confession of faith intended chiefly for the world at large, and is thus an intramundane affair, while the meaning and purpose of religion lie in the relationship of the individual to God. As such, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or Buddhism, the path of salvation and liberation. From this basic fact, all ethics is derived, which without the individual's responsibility before God can be called nothing more than conventional morality. Since there are compromises with mundane reality, the creeds have accordingly seen themselves obliged to undertake a progressive codification of their views, doctrines, and customs, and in doing so have externalized themselves to such an extent that the authentic religious element in them, the living relationship to and direct confrontation with their extra-mundane point of reference, has been thrust into the background. The denominational standpoint measures the worth and importance of the subjective religious relationship by the yardstick of traditional doctrine, and where there is not so frequent as in Protestantism, one immediately hears talk of pietism, sectarianism, eccentricity, and so forth as soon as anyone claims to be guided by God's will. A creed coincides with the established church, or, at any rate, forms a public institution whose members include not only true believers, but vast numbers of people who can only be described as indifferent in matters of religion and who belong to it simply by the force of habit. Here the difference between a creed and a religion becomes palatable. To the adherent of a creed, therefore, is not always a religious matter, but more often a social one, and as such it does nothing to give an individual any foundation. For support, he has to depend exclusively on his religion to an authority which is not of this world. The criterion here is not lip service to a creed, but the psychological fact that life of the individual is not determined solely by the ego and its opinions or by social factors, but quite as much, if not more, by a transcendent authority. It is not ethical principles, however lofty, or creeds, however orthodox, that lay the foundations for the freedom and autonomy of the individual, but simply and solely the empirical awareness, the incontrovertible experience of an intensely personal, reciprocal relationship between man and an extra-mundane authority which acts as a counterpoise to the world and its reason. This formulation will not please either the mass man or the collective believer. For the former, the policy of the state is the supreme principle of thought and action. Indeed, this was the purpose for which he was enlightened, and according to the mass man, grants the individual a right to exist, only insofar as the individual is the function of the state. The believer, on the other hand, while admitting the state has a moral and factual claim, confesses to the belief that not only man, but the state that rules him is subject to the overlordship of God, and that, in case of doubt, the supreme decision will be made by God and not by the state. Since I do not presume to any metaphysical judgments, I must leave it in an open question whether the world, the phenomenal world of a man, and hence nature in general, is the opposite of God or not. I can only point to the fact that psychological operation between these two realms of experience is not only vouched for in the New Testament, but is still exemplified very plainly today in a negative attitude of the dictator state to religion and of the church of atheism and materialism.